Well, can I thank you, first of all, formally for joining me on the podcast? Let me introduce you, Dr. Steven Laureys, neurologist and author of the No Nonsense Meditation book, A Scientist's Guide to the Power of Meditation. Really enjoyed the book, by the way. I will stick a link to your book in the show notes for this episode. And it's not the first book I had read on meditation, but it's a great introduction to the subject if you're not familiar with meditation or mindfulness, and I can highly recommend it. Can we go right back? Is it the case that your own interest in meditation was prompted by a marriage breakdown when you became interested in yoga? And in the book, you said you started living a more aware life. You were more mindful and you didn't find yourself complaining or worrying about the past or the future. You were living more so in the present moment because of meditation.
Absolutely. I'm a medical doctor, neurologist, and a scientist. So our challenge is to understand the human mind and neuroplasticity, recovery after coma. So as an expert in consciousness, was going through a very, very difficult moment indeed. That was 2012, and I, yeah, you know that was worrying thoughts, just keeping going from one to the other. How could this happen, and what's gonna happen next? And I couldn't sleep. And so what do? And many doctors actually do that when there's chronic stress. You drink, you smoke. My friends, colleagues, psychiatrists prescribed me sleeping pills, antidepressants. It wasn't the inspiring that I wanted to be. And then, yes, I started yoga, and importantly, at a TEDx talk in Paris, where I talked about consciousness and the brain. There was a talk by Mathieu Ricard. He's a Buddhist monk, wrote wonderful books. He's actually also a PhD, but then did kind of like his postdoc in the Himalayas, and now is a bit of a rock star of Buddhism. And he gave a TEDx there on meditation, invited me for a retreat, and that, Mathieu, was for me a new world. And I enjoyed it in such a way that I invited Mathieu Ricard, the Buddhist monk, into my lab in Belgium, and we studied his brain. And since we have a number of projects on how meditation and other practices, well, is good for you and changes your brain's structure and function.
Well, this is one of the draws of the book for me because you're a neurologist, you're a medicine man, you're a scientist, and you deal with evidence and facts and data. And this is lacking very often in a lot of the books which touch upon this subject. And so for me, with my own background in biochemistry and in science, this really spoke to me. You mentioned Mathieu Ricard there. He has a great quote in the book, or you quote him in the book. It says that meditation allows us to free ourselves from the tyranny of torments and mental confusion. Can I ask you, why is it the case that our brain is constantly in turmoil? Why is it never ever quiet?
Um, well, it can't help it. We've been studying the brain, my favorite organ, for over 25 years now. And even, as I said, our area of expertise is traumatic brain injury and coma, but also sleep, anesthesia. And we still see brain activity. You need to be brain dead for it to be completely silent. And well, we all know that continuous stream of conscious thoughts. We jump from one idea to the other, and feelings and perceptions, and it's not bad per se. I mean, this as a species made us incredibly good in surviving, anticipating what's going to happen, come up with a strategy, learn from previous experiences. But too much is just too much, and that's the other side of the coin. Then, those thoughts can become rumination, can make me all stressed out and not sleeping well. And that's a problem. The studies show that about 60% of the time, my thoughts are not really in the moment. with whatever task I'm doing at work or when I'm with my family. 60% of the time, which is a lot, I'm elsewhere mentally. I'm thinking about the future, what I need to do, or thinking about the past, what happened. So meditation is just an invitation to become aware of that, and then to train your focus and indeed live more in the present moment.
And what is the difference, if there is a difference, between meditation and mindfulness?
It's a very good question. To me, mindfulness is just one form of meditation. Meditation is how do you define it? It's a practice. And mindfulness is one exercise. Attention is a key word. So you can focus your attention on the here and now. But it's more than that. It's not just training your focus or dealing with stress differently or helping you with better sleep or creativity. It's also reconnecting with your emotional needs. How do I feel, really? How do you feel? How do we interact? Training empathy, compassion. And it's a little bit like sports. You know, you can say, I do sport, but what do you do exactly? And depending on the type of exercise you do, start running, grow muscles in your legs, swimming, big shoulders. You know, you're a big sport athlete, triathlon, and when you do these mental gymnastics, which for me meditation is just that. It's you need an MRI scan, which is what we used to see that there's things growing inside and the brain cells, the brain connections. But yeah, for me, mindfulness is just one form of meditation. And we study these monks, and I think one of the messages is we can do this in many different ways. We're not monks, or I'm not a Zen master or a Buddhist, and we do what we can. So the challenge is to have this, change the way we think and react, not just those 20 minutes on the meditation mat or cushion. So there's many ways to do it and to enjoy it. And definitely not only through the Buddhist angle. I'm talking to you from Canada, where I'm putting up a lab, and so working here with the First Nation Inuit and Native Americans, and they also have these practices. And when I give a talk in Australia, the Aboriginals tell me, well, we do mindfulness since before written history, and in those so-called primitive societies, Africa, wherever we call primitive, but I think it's very interesting to learn from those traditions, and that's what we try to do using neurotechnologies to understand them and translate them to our current needs.
Tell me more about this fascinating man, Mathieu Ricard, who became a friend and a guinea pig in your lab. How was he different? I remember looking at photographs in your book where he's covered in electrodes all over his head. And what he was able to show through his brain activity really astounded yourself and your colleagues.
Yes, no, I'm really very grateful. So he saw that famous TEDx talk in Paris that I wasn't doing well, invited me on this retreat, and then accepted to leave his monastery in the Himalayas and come to the lab, and we put him in all possible machines. MRI, we measured his brain structure, and we did what we call volumetry. So basically, if you measure the volume of his gray matter, it's bigger than expected for his age, 70 plus. He's like, neurologically speaking, 10, 15 years younger. And there's some parts that are just more developed. And I summarize them in the book: the anterior cingulate cortex, hippocampus, prefrontal areas, insula. So there is a visible impact in someone who has meditated a lot. And I then use him as a super guinea pig to illustrate, well, what do we know? What have all these studies, the past decades, shown when we look at meditation, of course, not only in Buddhist monks or those top athletes of the mind, but in people like myself who try to do what they can. And after 8 weeks, those mindfulness-based stress reduction programs, where we can again use neuroimaging, if you and I, we start to meditate, longitudinal studies show that we do see a change both in the gray matter, the volume of those neurons, but also the connections. That's the power. The white matter changes we can again capture with MRI. We looked at the brain's metabolic activity, so we injected radioactive sugar. Then you see how much energy is used. We measured electrical activity, how it changes when he's doing these different exercises. And as you say, it was remarkable how he had control over his thought processes, attention task, perception. We studied emotional control, and so yes, having him and later many others was for us a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very grateful because it helped me personally, as you mentioned, my crisis at the time. It launched a new series of scientific projects, and also as a medical doctor, a neurologist in my consultations or teleconsultations, I'm a lot abroad, I now prescribe meditation. So those three axes were really influenced by that meeting and by the research we did with the team.
What is the benefit of the increase in neural connectivity across both sides of the brain that comes as a result of meditation?
Yeah, so you have those billions of brain cells, thousands of billions of connections. With what is called diffusion MRI, we can capture those kinds of big highways connecting your left and right hemisphere, and we see that when you meditate, there's just more structural connectivity. So there's more interaction between different parts of the brain, and that permits your brain to function better. And that's what studies have shown. So again, it depends what exercise do you do. But it's clear that both in attentional networks, memory, but also emotional processing, the connection between what is called the amygdala, very important in emotional processing, and your prefrontal cortex, you really see a structural change. And as a neurologist, that's fascinating because when I was at university in the 80s, 90s, we had this kind of old view, more static. You have your brain cells and that's it. Of course, they change all the time, and that plasticity, that neuroplasticity, we studied in the damaged brain. Now more and more in our projects, we try to understand how we can make small changes in our life habits and observe structural and functional changes, and that is through those thousands of billions of connections that rewire actually all the time. Listening to your podcast, if we remember anything after it, will change those synaptic connections in the brain.
And can meditation decrease the size of the amygdala, which is in the center of emotion in the brain?
Yeah, absolutely right. So we shouldn't, of course, oversimplify. Your brain is so complicated. Very often we tend to reduce emotion to the size of the amygdala, or it's very important, but it's more complex than understanding the motor inside your car or a supercomputer. The brain, we tend to compare them with these machines, but it's such a terribly complex and ever-changing living organ in a soup of neurotransmitters. But you're absolutely right. The amygdala is key. It will really change its reactivity and size depending on how we are exposed to stress, react to it. We also saw it with COVID, very stressful, a lot of uncertainty. And so the brain doesn't like that. It makes us more stressed, anxious, and we saw an increase in that volume of the amygdala because we're just overreactive. And then meditation and other techniques can have a visible impact on these structures and how they react.
You detail multiple forms of meditation in the book, like focused attention meditation, open monitoring meditation, and loving kindness meditation. I'm interested to learn, does the fact that you can meditate in so many different ways make it even more of a challenge for scientists like yourself to understand and to come up with the data to convince people of meditation's efficacy? In other words, from a resource perspective, would it be simpler for you if there was only one way to meditate?
Yeah, of course, it's way simpler, and I also worked for the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, I give you a pill, you swallow it, and then there is less variability. Okay. Meditation, well, we need to define what do we mean, what practice exactly do we propose, how are you really going to do it. So there's in the controlled clinical trials where it's basically like looking at the effect of a drug as compared to a placebo. So how do we have like placebo or sham meditation? So it's a complicated literature, but it is what it is. It's like trying to understand the effect of sport or physical exercise on your physical and mental health. It's a challenge, but it can be done. And it has been shown. I mean, there's now so many studies. In the book, I show this graph of the past 20 years. There's just this explosion of research. It's no longer, I believe in it or I don't believe in it. It's backed up by science. And yet, as a physician now prescribing meditation, I think we need still more research. What are the exact indications for a specific medical condition? The contraindications, the possible side effects, we also need to talk about that. But at this stage, it's clear that the effect of meditation can be as big as the effect of medication, of the pills, um, when we look at anxiolytics, antidepressants, and painkillers. And it's not one or the other. I think it's important to use both. And that's what I call complementary medicine. I don't like the word alternative medicine, or to have oversimplified views like it's one or the other. I think we should invite patients and citizens to play a more active central role, and that's combined, of course, with the top-notch medicine and knowledge and technology, and the big pharma. I use every day as a neurologist and those brain scans, but I think we neglected a bit the role of the patient that was just, undergoing passively things, swallowing a pill or having an intervention. And there's indeed way more that we can do.
Well, following on from that, I found that it was very interesting that there was such a huge difference in the numbers of research studies that have been done on meditation over the years, over the last 20 years, say, in comparison with, let's say, antidepressants funded by the pharmaceutical industry. I think the figure was 1,300 papers, research studies have been done on meditation, and that's in 20 years, as opposed to 4,500 that are normally done annually on antidepressants by the pharmaceutical industry. So there's a huge imbalance there.
Yes, and when I go to conferences, of course, we have these stands and new drugs being presented, and it's a challenge for these companies, and yet I'm very optimistic. We need to combine both. And I'm very happy to see that there's really good labs all over the world now, doing basic research and translating it to the clinical reality. So that's fascinating. And you mentioned, well, what if there would be one exercise of meditation, of course my life would be easier, but I think it's very good that it's not the case, and that there's all these different practices. And sometimes I have the impression one wants to sell her or his practice, and claiming this is better than the rest. And there have been, of course, also problems with gurus, and abuse of very vulnerable people and patients. So that's not my message. I mean, there's, depending on your needs, many ways to practice meditation, and that's your personal journey. So yeah, I think it's wonderful for me as a scientist to share a bit of those studies, and as a physician to invite people to give it a try.
Well, you said there that meditation is just as effective as antidepressants, certainly for some patients. It's also effective in terms of chronic pain, apparently, according to one of the passages in your book.
Yes, as a neurologist, I see a lot of people with chronic pain, headaches, and again, stress makes it just worse. We also work with the army. When you have a soldier who's wounded on the battlefield, you can rip off an arm, he would barely feel it. If you have the same injury in your office, you would be screaming from pain. So pain is very subjective, and sometimes it can be very intense, and then your thoughts can go elsewhere, and it changes. And so for us, and we worked also a lot, not just with meditation, but with hypnosis. Again, we have a lot of preconceived ideas about hypnosis, and being used in theaters and shows, but we have now over 20,000 patients that had surgery, while being awake in the operating room, being dissociated, absorbed. So this really works. And as you said, for meditation, the effect can be as big as for the drugs. And why not use both, and again, empower people? So this is definitely not, the absolute cure for everything, but it is clear it can help us. And as mentioned, when we talk about pain, there's many factors, and when you're stressed out, it's just worse. When you don't sleep well, your pain will increase, and very often you have these double interactions. I would be in pain, it would
One compounds the other,
prevent me
basically.
from sleeping well, and then it would just increase the pain. It's the same for anxiety, it's the same for depression. So they're having tools to break that negative spiral, I think is very interesting, and I believe, and it's very strange. I was never at university, wasn't mentioned much, and I think we don't exploit it enough. So now we try to understand all of those practices that basically comes down to exploiting the power of the mind. Also in athletes, by the way.
What is the difference when it comes to brain activity between hypnosis and meditation?
So we actually we did a number of studies on hypnosis. In a nutshell, it's also about attention. So when you're in this hypnotic state, and by the way, I prefer to use auto hypnosis, because it's something that you do as a person, as a patient. But then you're in this kind of dissociated condition where you are thinking about pleasant memories, holidays, whatever. And so we see that your external awareness network, which is prefrontal, temporal-parietal, so it's the lateral side of the brain, is kind of disconnected. And you're having these pleasant autobiographical memory activating your internal awareness network, overlapping a bit with the default mode network that we see in fMRI and other studies. So that permits the surgeon to do his job. You still feel there's something, And we see activation in what we call the primary sensory areas, but not in the rest of that pain matrix, the cognitive and emotional component. So it bothers you less. Um, and it's different than meditation. So we use both in the pain clinic. So in meditation, you can, for example, really focus on the experience. Where is it painful? What is the intensity? And again, by doing that, you somehow are not getting lost in the big negative emotion that pain is, and you create some distance. And so you can alternate between both. We also work with pregnant women who are giving birth. And again, this is not something that excludes the use of painkillers. Definitely good we have these drugs, but we can use all the different techniques. So it's not exactly the same. The mechanisms, when we're in these meditative mindfulness or hypnotic states, but it's ongoing research. We really want to know exactly what's similar, what's different, and how can we then maybe propose it in more specific indications and clinical reality.
Well, something else that's being researched extensively at the moment, and I think will really grasp people's attention who are listening to this podcast episode, is meditation's ability to slow the aging process. Can you talk to us about this and the significance of telomeres?
Yes, with pleasure. We know, and there's this drawing in the book, we have the chromosomes, and then there's these little caps that protect our DNA. And when we get older, you better accept it. These things get smaller, and then you become more vulnerable for disease. And that process speeds up when you're in chronic stress. The good news is meditation is being repeatedly shown can positively impact that phenomenon. So we see an effect not just on the brain, but also at the level of the chromosomes. The brain, and we mentioned metabolic activity, also shows an effect. We again we age. It's just a reality, and so when we inject radioactive sugar, your brain uses a lot of energy. We can quantify that metabolic activity of those billions of brain cells, and it decreases after age 40 or so. But good news is it has been shown repeatedly that mental gymnastics like meditation can have a positive impact on that. We also saw it in the Buddhist monks we studied, but it's true for patients, for example, at risk for mild cognitive impairment, degenerative diseases, Alzheimer, big multicentric studies, and we collaborate we're a collaborator in those, but good to be clear, this is not a cure for Alzheimer. This is not a vaccine. We have no cure for those diseases, but it again gives patients a more active central role in how the disease can progress. So definitely, yes, we see an effect on age-related diseases, both in the brain and at the level of the chromosomes.
Can you tell me more about your current research? You work with patients who are unconscious, patients who are in a coma. Can you tell us about the progress of your research there?
So again, this notion of neuroplasticity, that the brain, it is a fragile organ, but it has this capacity to deal with challenges, traumatic, both physical and psychological. We see, of course, the most catastrophic situations, people with brain bleeding, stroke, drowning, cardiac arrest, in intensive care. That's where I spend a lot of the time, and then afterwards in neurorehabilitation, where our mission is to use all those machines, brain scans we've been discussing, to understand the process of recovery, and then to help functional recovery, that again, I think the old view was a bit simplistic. When you don't recover quickly after coma and you end up in what we used to call a vegetative state, a terrible name. We now refer to these people as being in an unresponsive wakefulness syndrome because they're awake but unresponsive to simple commands, and we show that actually many of them are minimally conscious, have also better prognosis, and we use the knowledge about neuroplasticity, about the brain healing itself, how we can help that process through drugs, but also through neuromodulation, so putting little electrical currents or magnetic stimulation, and using robotics. So we have these exoskeletons, and we really in patients where sometimes even after years, where the old school was, never ever you would see any improvement. And I think that was kind of a therapeutic nihilism. We thought there's nothing we can do for none of these patients, and that's not true. Some of them can recover. It's not, miracle like in Hollywood movies, but sometimes small changes have big impacts on their quality of life. So that's what we try to do together with the different partners in the rehab centers.
In the book, you talk to well-known neuroscientist, philosopher, and all-round colossal intellect, Sam Harris. He's a podcaster too. He's a real proponent of meditation, and he's quite critical, though, of the fact that meditation is not taught in schools. Would you hold the same view?
You mean that we need meditation in schools?
Yes.
I absolutely agree, and I try also, being a little bit of a respected neuroscientist and being in all those different associations and interest by the media to convince our politicians that it's very strange how we keep neglecting mental well-being. And after the Second World War, we made physical activity, and we have a teacher, doing gymnastics, and it's part of the curriculum, I think, all over the world. Why not do the same for our mental well-being? I think it's just a question of time. I think we have a lot of preconceived ideas. We think this is Buddhist or this is, new age, fluffy, whatever. I think more than ever in these times where we have social media, we're hyper connected behind screens, talking about artificial intelligence and how we are different with our natural intelligence, but also because we feel, we have needs and pleasures and emotions, where sometimes we need to reconnect, and I think that's what we should help young people, and it should start at school. I see many people in my consultation who come to see me because they crashed. So we only tend to pay attention when we have our tension headaches or sleeping problems or anxiety, burnout, whatever, and that's a pity. And I think we really should invest more in prevention, and we should give those tools to the young people. My wife is a psychologist. She gives mindfulness in schools. I give a lot of lectures also in schools. And every time I ask the question, how are you and what are your challenges and needs? And it's really impressive how even very young people are under stress and expectations are high, what we ask from them. So yes, please give them the tools, and it can be done. It's just a political decision, and fully agree with that need, and try to work in that direction.
And should apps be involved in that process too? I know you mentioned Calm and Headspace, those very well-known apps that people can access online. You detail those really without bias, but if I had to really pressure you into whether you're for apps or against apps when it comes to introducing people to meditation, would you be?
I have many patients who are very happy. Me myself, I'm a big fan. But then there's others who, don't like it. So there's many things out there, the books, there's wonderful things on the internet, but then of course there's real healthcare professionals and people who can guide you, and that's a personal choice. So I'm a big fan. Personally, I see many of the patients are helped by these, also the wearables. People who ask me questions, well, am I meditating correctly? I need some feedback. So again, there's tools there. Even a Belgian company I like very much. It's called Moonbird. Check them out. They have this
Moonbird. Okay.
tool that you hold in your hand, this little moonbird, and then it measures your heart rate. So it can adapt and it would expand when you need to inhale, and then it contracts and you exhale. It's not necessary, but many people, especially those who, tend to worry. How should I do this? Am I doing it correctly? I don't know. Those can be helpful. Also, the Muse band, of course, measuring the brain's electrical activity, giving you feedback. I think it's wonderful. Why not take benefit of those technological advances?
Just a couple of more questions before I let you go because time is running short for us and I don't want to keep you too long. Have you studied near-death experiences? Did I read that? Was that right?
Yes, absolutely. So we see a lot of people who go through critical situations, coma. And again, it's a tricky subject. That's why we study it. So people who we think are unconscious, and yet afterwards they tell me, I was thinking, and very much so. I felt actually great, and some of them left their body and have these out of body experiences, telling me the resuscitation scene, seeing the light. But we need more evidence. So with the team, we've been publishing on this. I'm preparing a book on the subject because I think it's fascinating, but again, it's a bit polarized. I believe, I don't believe. We just try to understand the phenomenon that currently we fail to explain scientifically. And that is because it's dealing with one of science's biggest mysteries. That's your own mind, your consciousness, thoughts, perceptions, emotions. It would be very arrogant to claim we understood it all. So we just need, I think, more research, curiosity. But absolutely, if anyone hearing this had such an experience, please share it with us. You can find my email address. We have now tens of thousands of these testimonies, but we still need more because many things are happening. And for some of my colleagues, this is just a hallucination. We can explain this by lack of oxygen or neurochemicals. I would disagree. I also would disagree, not making any friends here, Mathieu, with those who say, well, this is proof of life after death, and wonderful bestsellers being written. I think scientifically it's challenging to make those claims. We, again, need, and that's what we do, more research.
Well, that topic and that book is certainly going to be the subject of a future episode if I can get you back onto the podcast.
With pleasure.
One more question before I let you go, Dr. Laureys. If you had all the research funding in the world today, how would you spend it as far as finding out more about the brain and your work and your research is concerned?
So it's a challenge, of course. As a researcher, I search for money, and that permits me to pay people, brilliant minds who are going to reduce our ignorance of science, biggest mystery, and then translate that knowledge to the clinic, because that's what I try to do as a medical doctor. And I'm very, very happy to do so. So yes, please, for those with lots of money, always happy for donations, always happy also to give conferences and share what we know and do not know about what's so important and yet so challenging to understand, our own internal universe.
Well, it sounds like you'll be kept busy for a time yet. Dr. Steven Laureys, neurologist and author of the No Nonsense Meditation book, A Scientist's Guide to the Power of Meditation. Thank you so much for giving me of your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take good care and speak soon after the next book.